Hey everyone, Attorney Davis Younts here. Listen, I wanted to start the three-part video series we're doing this week with the historical context for everything else that's been a part of headlines and court cases you're seeing. All of this relates to illegal immigration, the census, and how that impacts voting and voter rights. So there's been a lot of stories in the news. Lately, Texas has been the most recent sort of tipping point or focal point for this controversy that goes into issues of voter ID laws, how we count voters, as well as how decisions related to those things impact congressional representation. So here's where I want to start. I want to start with the history of what we're talking about. Many of you have probably heard of something called the gerrymander. Listen, this goes back to 1812 when one of the founders, one of the signers, was governor of Massachusetts. His name was Elbridge Gerry, and he created and approved, or at least approved of a district, a voting district, congressional district that looked so odd and so bizarre that it was called the gerrymander because it looked like a salamander or a dragon. And so we've heard that term and we've used that term, and that's just a term for when political lines are drawn, congressional districts or state house or Senate districts are drawn in such a way as to favor a particular political outcome. In other words, instead of looking at things like a county or traditional geographic boundaries of a city, politicians have made it a practice of literally drawing lines in such a way that they can try and predict or influence the outcome of an election. So the history goes all the way back to Elbridge Gerry, who's in many respects a very good guy, but it is kind of funny that he ended up getting this label for him. So what's going on now? Why does that matter now? Well, we've seen recent examples of purple and blue states in particular trying to impact the outcome of elections. For example, the state of Pennsylvania, election lines were drawn up, redistricting was done because it's done every 10 years, right? Let's start with that. Every 10 years, per the Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, there has to be a census, an enumeration of the population. The whole point of that is to making sure there is fair representation within the House of Representatives. Remember, this was all part of a compromise between large states and small states to say, okay, each state gets 2 senators, and then representation within the House will be based on state population. So getting that population right every 10 years is critically important. So what happens then, and people I think sometimes don't realize the importance of this, every 10 years, so it was 2010, then it was 2020, is when the census is done. Those population numbers then are given to the states, and it's the state House and Senate, the state representatives, that then create the boundary lines both for state elections as well as congressional seats within their state. It's also where apportionment is done, and sometimes states will lose and other states will gain a member of the House of Representatives based on population change. So one of the phenomena we've seen in recent years is states like California and New York have had a significant population change where anyone who can afford to and is a reasonable, free-thinking person is fleeing those states because of high taxes, high crime, socialist policies of liberal, woke governors in those states. So people are fleeing and they're moving to Texas. They're moving to Florida. They're moving to other states where there's still freedom, but also that have been, at least more recently, red states. So what happens then is what you should see logically would be a change in the number of representation, number of representatives in Congress. If California loses a significant chunk of population, if New York loses a significant chunk of population, if Texas or Florida gain population, there should be an increase in the number of congressional representatives in the House from those states. But there's a wrinkle in this. The 2020 census was a total and complete mess. Not only was it being done by the Biden administration with a huge emphasis on counting illegal immigrants, overrepresenting the population in blue areas, underrepresenting the population in red areas, because the census is run by the U.S., the federal level, the Federal Census Bureau. But you also have the issue of COVID impacting the way the census was conducted, so they sort of changed the rules. So there's a huge argument to be made that the way the census was done in 2020 could have an impact of up to 10 seats in Congress, going from one state to another or swinging from blue to red or vice versa, just because of the way the sentence was conducted. So this has been something that President Trump has been looking at and talking about, and others have been looking at as well. So what does this mean? What's the issue? Well, fundamentally, from a common sense perspective, we can all recognize the very simple principle that if the census is going to impact congressional representation, that's something we have to get right. If it's not done properly, it can impact the outcome of elections. And you have seen blue states like New York, like California, intentionally recruit an influx of illegal immigrants, doing things like having sanctuary cities and encouraging illegal immigrants to come in. And what that does then is replace the population of those people who have fled the progressive ideology and the high taxes, and replace them with illegal immigrants who can't vote and who tend to be a drain on resources, but at the same time allow those liberal politicians and those progressives to inflate their population numbers and try to gain or keep control of state houses, state assemblies in these states, as well as try to impact control of Congress. So that becomes a really, really critical issue. So let's talk about the law for a moment. So one of the things that's talked about a lot is the actual language of Article 1, Section 2, and it talks about total population. And so the argument has been from the liberal progressive side of this that it talks about total population, so there's really no distinction or no legal grounds for distinction between illegal immigrants and those that are present and residing in an area legally and lawfully. Well, that brings up a lot of problems. And again, I think sometimes we have to look at modern scenarios and understand it. At the time the Constitution was written, remember, there were two aspects of Article 1, Section 2 we don't talk about. One was the 3/5 compromise, which was it was a compromise that was done for political expediency, but ultimately the 3/5 compromise was erased from the Constitution by the 14th Amendment. Equal protection, a person is a person. We're not going to use that sort of calculation for population. But there's also a provision in Article 1, Section 2 that's still there that talks about untaxed Native American or untaxed Indian populations. And the untaxed Indian populations were not counted as part of the census. So that showed that those were individuals that the United States didn't have sovereignty over because they had their nations, their historical tribal lands and tribal authority and tribal sovereignty. And so because they were untaxed, they weren't counted as part of the population. I think there's clear legal precedent and just an acknowledgement by the framing of the Constitution and understanding that there could be portions of the population that should not be included in a census. And obviously that's illegal immigrants. People who are not legally in the United States should not be allowed to inflate the population for purposes of representation of sanctuary cities, sanctuary states, etc. That's not only replacing American citizens and watering down their vote, it just does not make common sense and it doesn't fit with our law. Now, there are some who will watch this video and counter and say, hey, didn't the Supreme Court address this? And I want to reference this quote to get it right. But didn't the Supreme Court address this in 2016 in the Evenwell versus Abbott case? And didn't the Supreme Court say that total population means total population, not just citizens? Therefore, this is a dead issue. The Supreme Court has resolved it. Well, first of all, I think there were some really interesting problems with some of the analysis in the opinion written by Justice Ginsburg. Now, it was an 8-0 opinion, but you really have to look to the concurring opinions from Justice Thomas and Justice Alito to really understand some of the nuances here. But here's a couple of points I want to be very clear on. Don't let progressive talking heads or others overstate what this case stood for. This case in 2016 did not directly address the issue of illegal immigrants. It also did not directly address the current circumstances in which you had a president in Biden intentionally import millions of illegal immigrants and try to change the population landscape of the United States. You also didn't have cities and states to the extent they are now creating these sanctuary cities. So there's just factual changes that have occurred. But again, that case did not address the question of whether or not illegal immigrants must be counted in the census. What it was addressing is whether people sued Texas. Texas had a scheme for counting the population. Some voters sued Texas and said, we don't agree with what you're doing. We think you should be using a different standard to determine population. And the Supreme Court said, essentially, we're going to defer to Texas and what Texas did. So in my mind, if a state like Texas challenged the census, or if President Trump, as he has talked about, actually ordered the conducting of a new census, or a bill was passed in Congress to order the conducting of a new census that does not count illegal immigrants, I think there's actually room, and I think there's clear legal theory that would support a conclusion that that could be done. And again, this is a critical issue because it impacts so much of what happens in our election, and it goes to a fundamental issue of congressional representation. We have a very divided Congress. We have a very divided House. And even now, Texas is talking about redrawing their districts based on more accurate language and interpretation. And listen, this has been done to conservative Republicans. Scott Perry in Pennsylvania was the target of this. Scott Perry is an excellent congressman. He is a military veteran. He's one of the founding members of the Freedom Caucus in the House. He's been a true standout statesman for freedom and liberty. And they specifically tried in Pennsylvania to redraw his district. He used to be my representative, to redraw his district in an absurd way. And it was clear what they were doing was trying to get rid of him. And it resulted in a very, very close election results. He's been reelected since they did that. But it was just absurd what they did. And it was clear they were directly targeting him. That really shouldn't be the purpose of redrawing these districts. Now, every party has engaged in some level of gerrymandering. That's fair. But really what we should be looking at as a starting point is, does the census actually represent the American people? Does it actually carry out the founders' intent to form a legal, appropriate, fair, and reasonable basis for determining the level of representation that a state or that a geographic area receives in Congress? And I'll submit to you that counting people who are there illegally, particularly in an environment where the Biden administration intentionally inflated the numbers of illegal immigrants, and you have blue states that are losing population because of bad policies, because they're destroying their states, then recruiting illegal immigrants to come in to try to increase their representation even though they've lost voters. That is not a sustainable model. That's the wrong model. That does not make sense. And there is clear constitutional legal precedent for states and for the federal government to understand what is meant by population, what that meant. There's precedent for excluding those who are not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, who are not taxed, and who would not be voting in the election. And just like Native Americans at that time, who were part of a tribal nation, fell under a different sovereign, illegal immigrants that are not citizens of the United States fall under a different sovereign. There is a clear logical analogy there, and I do think there would be support for this in the courts as well as in the Supreme Court. Hey, thanks for watching this video. Please follow us on social media and stay tuned for the next 2 parts of this series. Thanks, and take care. So at a very young age, I was 8 years old, and my parents were involved in a lawsuit against the state of Pennsylvania with the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. That had an impact on me, being involved in that, understanding that. So I took that forward and had an interest in the law that I've carried with me. I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. So every military member does that. So if the military members' rights are not protected, they're not protected for the rest of society. These are the individuals that are actually willing to risk their lives to fight for the Constitution and to protect society. Here is this. If you are a Christian, you need to understand that part of your Christian walk, part of your faith journey, is that God is going to call you for a moment. There will be a phone call that comes from for you. And I ask you this, are you willing? Will you be willing when that phone call came? I praise God that I was willing to answer that call. It's why I'm here today. It's why I met some of the great men that are here, the people that are here.
So it's left to men like Davis Younts to fight for these Navy SEALs.
Yeah, so I was in law school when 9/11 happened, so I was a true believer back then, so I joined the Air Force, applied to the JAG Corps.
With reaction is Davis Younts, a military defense attorney with Younts Law. Davis, thank you for being here today.
Riley, it's always an honor to join you.
Davis Younts has been instrumental in defending service members that they tried to kick out of the military for not taking that poison.
So why are the politicians in Iowa allowing it?
Fear. They're afraid to take a stand, and they're afraid to challenge this.
If you're a Christian, your sovereign king, the king of the universe, has already given you an order. Your king has made a call to go into all the world and make disciples. The only question for us is, will we answer it?